Oh, that went off fast. Welcome in, everybody. I would say welcome to today's episode of podcast name, but I don't have a podcast name. We're just here to introduce Brian. I'm really honored to introduce Brian here. Brian Hite of, what's your website again? Magi
MagiRising.com.
Rising. Brian's going to be sharing his insight on the 12,000 year cycle and the Age of Aquarius, exploring these ancient patterns, where we are in this cosmic timeline, and what it means for us now. Brian and I have debated quite a bit back and forth on how to go about this, but we think it's best that Brian just speaks because he's so knowledgeable in this area. I may have a question here and there, but Brian, you take it from here.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on here. I really appreciate it. I think, first of all, I should tell you how I got to where I'm at today, and why I'm here speaking with you about this information. Um, Growing up, I was raised predominantly in a Protestant Christian household, fairly conservative Christian household. And in my childhood, I had a series of events that I don't have a lot of time to go into right now, but I wound up going into foster care in my childhood, and I was bounced around from foster home to foster home throughout my childhood, dozens of them. And each time that we was placed in a different home, we found ourselves in a new environment with different religious views. And so I was exposed early on to a wide array of religious beliefs, primarily conservative Christianity and Protestantism and all of its flavors. But it's important to my story to know that that was the background for my worldview and for my level of spirituality. I very much was a strong believer in Christianity. And then about 20 years ago, it was the winter of 2003 and 2004. I had a very interesting spiritual experience that um, it's kind of difficult for me to talk about and share with people because of the nature of it. And not everybody is open to hearing that. But I'm familiar with your channel and the wonderful community you've got. So um, late one night in the middle of the winter time, my oldest child had just been born. She was a couple of months old,
Mhm.
and my mother had came down from Missouri uh, to visit to see her new grandbaby and everything. And so we were, kind of hanging out, doing our own thing. And my ex, who I was with at the time, got tired. She had just had a new baby, and all of you mothers know how exhausting that can be.
Amen.
So she went inside and had went to sleep, and I stayed up for a couple more hours talking with my mom. And out of nowhere, my ex walks outside and stood between us with her eyes closed, and she was kind of, didn't have her bearings about her, and I could tell that she was sleepwalking or something. So I kind of nudged her a little bit and told her to go lay down, go to sleep. And she became inconsolable, very visibly upset and shaken. And she started crying all of the children, all of the poor children. And she was so upset she wouldn't go back in the house. We actually had to load up our child and go with my mom to Missouri because because she was so shaken up by whatever she had seen.
Mhm.
At this point, I assumed she had a really bad nightmare. Um, but later that night, hours later, into the early hours of the morning at this point, she was calm enough to tell me that she had this vision that she was in a village, and these soldiers came into this village and took all of the children,
Mm.
killed them, and put them on these giant pyres and burned them. And I do apologize for the imagery, but I don't
No.
want any details here. She didn't want to talk about it beyond that, and I didn't want to push her because I'd never experienced anything like this. I could tell by the look on her eyes when she was explaining this to me. It was almost like she was drawn back into the experience, and she became upset all over again. So I kind of just left it alone and let it be. And of course, my mom was standing right there. She's seeing all of this and didn't know what to think about it.
Mm.
So the next night is when things really started to get interesting. It started the same way. Um, my mom and I were outside talking, and my ex got tired and went to sleep. And we stayed up for a couple of hours, probably discussing what in the world had just occurred, you know. And whenever I went in and laid down beside my ex to go to sleep, she started moving around a lot, like she was waking up. And then she started speaking, but she was speaking in a different language that I didn't understand.
Mm.
But it was obvious that it was a foreign language. And then the foreign language evolved into a broken English, like someone who was speaking it as a third language. She struggled to find certain words or meanings of words. Sometimes even the pronunciation was a little off. But she sat up. We were both sitting on the bed at this point, and she had her eyes closed the entire time. And she, she kept referring to me as Magi. And after the fourth or fifth time, I asked her, "What is that? What do you mean?" And she said, "It is what you are, it is in your blood, and it means God's warrior." And I, obviously at this point, I was in awe and taken aback at this experience that was going on. And she proceeded to tell me that she had been sent to me and that she was to help me to awaken and to charge me with my calling. And I asked her what exactly that was. And she told me that it will happen in the time of your children's children. And I remember, even though this is 20 years ago, I remember experiencing the fact that my conscious mind had no idea what she was talking about. But deep within me, my soul knew exactly what she meant. And I felt a wave of sadness about that. And I asked her what was going to happen, what I needed to do. And she told me that I must save as many of God's people as I could. And I asked her from what. And at this point, we're sitting across from each other, um, Indian style on the bed. And she leaned forward and kind of, placed her hands on my temples. And I braced myself for this vision that I was sure I was going to receive.
Mm.
And it never came. Nothing happened. And after a few moments, I decided to open my eyes and see what was going on. And my ex had fell backwards on the bed, and she started experiencing this vision. And it was quite obvious that she was experiencing it, not simply having a dream. Uh,
Right.
After a few moments, it kind of things I could tell escalated. She showed signs of obvious agitation and distress, and that escalated and escalated to the point she grabbed her throat and started coughing, and it appeared to me that she was struggling to breathe. I was concerned that she was dying. It was that extreme. So I woke her up. And at this point, my ex is fully conscious and she is beyond consolement at this point. She's extremely upset. bawling and wailing,
Mhm.
and said that her throat hurt and that her lungs burned. And after a few moments, she calmed enough to tell me that she had this vision. And it's actually a very short vision without a whole lot of detail. But she said that she was walking with a group of people. Everyone was walking, there was no cars.
Mhm.
And they were walking between four stone towers. And all of a sudden, there was a massive explosion that destroyed all of the buildings and knocked everyone off their feet. And then she said that everyone grabbed their throats and started coughing up blood. And that was the end of the vision.
Hmm.
And so I obviously didn't know what to make of any of this. And I started having this conversation with my ex and discovered she remembered nothing of the conversation that we had had. She thought I was making it up. The only thing she remembered was the vision, which apparently stuck with her. For 2 or 3 days, she told me that her lungs burned.
Hmm.
And the next night, these series of experiences continued to happen. And we had many conversations, and a lot was said in there. But the very next night, I asked her higher self, which is what I am convinced at this point was going on. I believe that when my ex was asleep, unconscious, that her higher self came through and
Mhm.
spoke to me through her. I asked about the vision, and she told me that it was Yellowstone and that it was
Hmm.
going to erupt and that it would
Mhm.
happen in the time of my children's children. So it's important to know that this was not the only time that these things happened. I was told about my past lives. I was told about things of the future. We had many conversations like this for almost a year. Um, but because of the topic today and the limitation of time, I'm going to have to, you know, save that for another time, perhaps. But the important thing is the vision that she had, and that she said I was being called by God to bring this information to the world and to do whatever it is in my power to save as many people as I possibly could. So, the very last time that we had one of these encounters, she told me that it would be the last time she spoke with me, and that my ex was going to leave me, and that I would meet my future wife, and that we would have many children, and that they would be important. It would be important for me to teach them. And 2 weeks later, sure enough, the conversation happened and we parted ways. And that very week, I met my wife that I'm with right now. And we have many children. That's the short version of that.
Beautiful.
So for many years, for several years, I really wrestled with this.
Mhm.
And I don't want to take too much time off of the actual topic, but this is an important point, I think, for everybody, especially that comes from the world of Christianity. I really wrestled with the things that I was told and I was shown. Early on, anyone that I talked to, my friends group, my coworkers, colleagues, family members, they
Mhm.
were all deeply embedded in mainstream conservative Christianity.
Mhm.
And so, pretty much every single time I was met with, this is the work of the devil. You know, this was demonic possession. It was this, it was that. Um, Even though I was specifically told about how I needed to pray for 7 days for compassion, to learn forgiveness and patience, and numerous other things. Not to mention the fact that I was there. I experienced these things, and it wasn't just like talking to someone who was in a hypnotic trance. It was a very powerful spiritual experience. I felt almost as if I was in the presence of divinity every time that this happened. It was overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
And so I couldn't accept everyone telling me, oh, this was the work of the devil. But at the same time, my Christian worldview um, clashed with the things that I was told, things about karma and reincarnation and past lives, and
Mm-hmm.
even the nature of these visions and this contact with the higher self of my ex. And so I came to a point where I said both of these cannot be true. Either one of them is true and the other one is wrong, or vice versa. But they're so contradictory, it's not possible for them both to be true. And so I set out on a quest seeking after truth for several years. And this was very much a dark night of the soul for me, because the very root, the foundation of who I was and what I believed was shaken. And long story short, I now believe that they are very much both true and both correct,
Mm-hmm.
from what I believe and what I've been led to by spirit. For several um, for several years after my wife and I first were together, I dedicated hours of each and every single day to praying about these things, for the truth to be revealed to me. And it was through prayer that I was led to the work of Edgar Casey, the sleeping prophet. I
Mm-hmm.
had never heard of him before. And the way that I came across him and his story was very synchronistic. It happened immediately after praying for the truth. That if these things were true, then how come, the Bible says this and the Bible says that, or people translate it to say this? Why the contradiction? If
Right.
both of these are true, then I need you to hold me by the hand and walk me into that truth.
Right. Right.
And then immediately I stumbled across um, a documentary titled "The Sleeping Prophet," and I seen it and I put it back. I was like, okay, whatever. And then several times it kept coming right back up into my face, to the point that I knew, okay, there's something there. I'm going to watch this. For anybody who does not know, Edgar Casey was basically an illiterate man born in Kentucky, very rural Kentucky. And he was very much from the very conservative Protestant Christianity world. He was actually a Sunday school teacher. And his story, again, is too much for me to cover here, but he had an experience while in prayer in a grove of trees. I think he was about 13, somewhere around there, where an angel of God appeared before him and basically said, you can have anything you want. All you have to do is believe. And he said, I've always wanted to help. I want to be of assistance to my fellow human beings. And the angel told him not to worry about it, to go back to sleep. And when he woke up, his prayer would be answered. And then several years later, he discovered, because he had lost his voice and a doctor recommended hypnosis, he discovered he had the ability to put himself to sleep and into a hypnotic state, to where he could access the Akashic records. And in doing so, over the course of his lifetime, he gave over 14,000 different life readings. The vast majority of them, I discovered, were aimed at helping people with diseases, physical ailments that mainstream medical world had no answer for at that time. And it evolved from the health readings into talking about past lives and um, the future as well. He gave many, many different predictions, several of which have came true, such as World War II, the Great Depression, several things that were worded very precisely, not extremely vague like you see with some psychic predictions like Nostradamus. They were very specific and even gave dates.
Mhm.
And once those things happened, he started to get a lot of attention, right? And once I came across this information, I noticed that Edgar Casey's story was perfect for my situation because, in many ways, his spiritual experience, not just the one I told you about, but several of them, were very closely mirroring what had happened to me. And for decades, he wrestled with the very same thing that I was currently wrestling with, which was, if these things are true, then why does the Bible say you live one life and then afterwards you will face judgment and either eternal reward or eternal punishment based on the results of that one lifetime? So he wrestled with these very same things, and that's what really sucked me in. And then I started really diving into Edgar Casey and his work. And I noticed that he had several readings where he predicted what he called earth changes that were going to begin happening on our planet. And I like that you brought that up. I didn't know you were going to share this. So this map and several others is actually largely based off of the readings that Edgar Casey gave, um, among others like Gordon Michael Scallion. But numerous sources have all converged on a very similar type of event. And
Mhm.
that's a story all of its own. But essentially, Edgar Casey predicted that beginning in 1998, there was going to be a beginning of the shift of the poles of our planet, and that earth changes would begin happening, climates would begin shifting, the flora and fauna would begin acting strangely. And he talked about later on the entire face of the planet being changed, such as the pretty much the whole of the western coast of the United States would go into the ocean, that the coastlines would be flooded in on the east coast. And he mentioned that the Mississippi would be flooded essentially because of the emptying of the Great Lakes into the Gulf of Mexico via the Mississippi River corridor. He said that all of these things would occur basically because of the shifting of the poles. And he mentioned, as this map shows, that a part of Atlantis would rise again. This was the first part of the Earth change information I had really came across, but because of its relation to the vision that I was shown, I really started to dig in deeper into this information. And then I came across a story that was woven together over decades throughout numerous readings that Edgar Casey gave. So this wasn't a continuation, or it wasn't a singular story that he told in one setting. It was from giving life readings from several people over many years, but pieced together, they tell a very vivid story about the destruction of Atlantis. And basically, what he said is that 12,000 years ago, on the same cycle that we're on right now, the Earth underwent a series of catastrophic Earth changes. And the inhabitants of Atlantis, the civilization, were very advanced, in many ways, much more advanced than we are, but along different lines, not in terms of computers and cell phones, but in terms of energy and vibration. And so they were very in tune with the earth and with spirit, and they knew that these changes were coming. And he said that the majority of the inhabitants of Atlantis fled to South America and Middle America, some in North America. And the high priest at the time and his followers went to the land of Kemet, which we know of today as ancient Egypt. He said that they were led there by spirit and by a multitude of disciplines, such as astrology and geomancy and divination and on and on and on. But they picked this area very specifically to build a monument, not a monument to Atlantis, but a monument to humanity itself and to this 12,000 year cycle, because they knew what was coming. Shortly after they fled, the earth changes increased, and the continent of Atlantis broke up and disappeared beneath the ocean, according to Edgar Cayce. And then the high priest and his followers built the Great Pyramid. This is one of, I know I'm skipping forward in the story a little bit here. You might be wondering, why in the world is this guy talking about the Great Pyramid when we're talking about earth changes, right? But what I discovered through the Edgar Cayce material is that the Atlanteans, their civilization having been destroyed, rebuilt on several sites across the planet. And the primary one for the high priest of that time was the Giza Plateau. And he was led by spirit to construct, using divine architecture, the Great Pyramid. And he gave specifics about exactly when it was made, the period of time that it was built. And of course, that does conflict with what mainstream archaeologists and Egyptologists say. But there's a lot of evidence that actually all but disproves the official narrative whenever it comes to the building of these structures. And I can talk about that a little bit later if you want. Essentially, the story of the Great Pyramid, according to Edgar Cayce, is the story of humanity, that it was built for a very specific purpose, and that was to stand as a monument to the 12,000 year cycle in general. And so they built this fantastic monument that science really has no answers for today. We've tried to answer it, and there's been thousands of different theories that it's from aliens, that it was a power generator, that it was the tomb of a megalomaniac pharaoh, and everything in between. But the story of the Great Pyramid, according to Edgar Cayce, is the one that makes the most sense to me whenever you look at the big picture, especially considering the 12,000 year cycle. It's obvious that the builders were very advanced architects and engineers, that they had a mastery of mathematics. And I don't want to go too far off the rails here, but I want to mention just a couple of points here to drive this point home. I am a builder. I come from the construction world and building. So one of the details of the building of the Great Pyramid that really floored me when I first discovered this is that the foundation for the building of this pyramid is, its base is over 13 acres square, and it is to within 1 inch of variance out of level, over 13 acres. I've built numerous foundations. I've done a lot of earthwork. I've done a lot of concrete work. And I can tell you that to get something that level on the side of a home building site is, that means you've done your job well. To pull that off over 13 acres is almost, it's almost unfathomable without GPS guided laser transits. And that's if you're leveling earth. They did not remove sand for this. They carved the bedrock level to within less than 1 inch out of level over a 13-acre base. That in itself, to me, points that something was going on here other than our ancient ancestors using soft copper chisels and rudimentary tools without an understanding of mathematics. There's far too long of a list for me to go through all of the specifics about the incredible accuracy that this building was used for. But if you look into that, it becomes obvious that this was not merely a tomb for a megalomaniac pharaoh. And it was built very purposely for a very specific reason. Edgar Casey said that the Atlanteans built it with several different functions. The main primary function was to assist us now in this very generation as the cycle unfolds, the 12,000 year cycle, and our Earth undergoes changes again at the end of the age. And he even gave some specifics about how that would work. He basically said that 2.5 million stone blocks make up the Great Pyramid. They have a high concentration of quartz in these stones. It's not simply stone. And quartz is an excellent capacitor for energy. And it is built in such a way and placed on a high point of intersection of all of the ley lines of the Earth so that it collects the Earth's energy as a giant capacitor. And then the passageways and corridors that snake through the Great Pyramid, through the Queen's Chamber, and then higher into the King's Chamber, condenses that energy and focuses it, raising its vibration and intensity. Much like if you were to take a magnifying glass outside and focus a beam of light through it, that energy that is diffuse and scattered becomes so intensely focused that it can start a fire. It's the same concept with the pyramids, according to Edgar Casey. And that this energy is not just like pure electrical energy. Energy is consciousness. It is vibration. And so the Great Pyramid was also known as the Temple of Initiation. He claimed that initiates into the mystery orders for thousands of years received their initiation in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid, including very pivotal figures such as Yeshua or Jesus and John the Baptist. Basically, they would be led through these corridors in ritualistic fashion, and they would be laid into this giant 50-ton sarcophagus, and the lid slid closed. And this happens to be the very point of the focus of all of this tremendous energy into the sarcophagus. And there they would experience a form of bodily death. And then they would cross over into the spirit world for 3 days. And whenever they came back, they were forever changed. Because you can intellectually think that spirits are real, that the spirit world is real, and think in terms of frequency and vibration and all of these things. But when you've lived in that and experienced it for 3 days, there's no room for doubt. There's no room for second guessing. And this was part of the process of their initiation, according to Edgar Casey. He applied the same concept to humanity as a whole, saying that the Great Pyramid would act as a bolster for human consciousness during this shift, as the poles shifted. There is an aspect of the 12,000 year cycle that we'll go into the science and the mechanism of it after this. But there's an aspect of it in previous cycles to where civilization is reset. humanity rises in its progression to a peak in civilization. And then every 12,000 years, the cycle unfolds and wipes the slate clean, and civilization is reset. And the survivors walk away with mass amnesia. Science, unknowingly, without knowledge of this story, have uncovered the physical mechanism of that amnesia. It has something to do with the magnetosphere. But essentially, what Edgar Casey was saying here is that in previous cycles, the survivors, the remnants, had to start from scratch, basically taken back to the Stone Age with this prevalent amnesia, not knowing their true history, not knowing where they came from. And the Atlanteans, and all of their knowledge and wisdom, wanted to prevent that in this next cycle. And that was the primary function of the building of the Great Pyramid. Another important function that will become relevant later on in the story is, he said that they built the pyramids in such a way that each stone, from the entrance through each corridor leading up all the way through the king's chamber, is a prophecy set in stone. Each stone was placed so intentionally as a marker in time that told the entirety of the human timeline from the moment of the last destruction all of the way through the 12,000 year history to the end point of this cycle, and marking the beginning of the next cycle, or the Age of Aquarius. And that, although it was first discovered by Edgar Casey, it has been studied by several researchers. And one of my favorites on that topic is, drawing a blank here, John Van Auken. I can't believe I forgot his name. He wrote a book entitled 2038, The Great Pyramid Timeline Prophecy. Building on the work of other researchers and investigating this himself, him and other key researchers have translated the Great Pyramid Timeline Prophecy and have arrived at the end date for that cycle as the year 2038, which I find very interesting because it's alignment with science and with what I was told about the vision, the time of my children's children. To give you an idea, my oldest daughter just gave birth to my first grandchild 2 weeks ago. So that puts things for me really into frame whenever it comes to this information and my calling. Because although the time of my children's children sounds vague, I don't know exactly what's meant by that. The fact that my grandchild has been born means to me that it could be any time between now and their adult life. So it would certainly fit the 2038 narrative.
Mm-hmm. Water break.
Okay. So after I learned all of this, I had to, because of the way my mind works, I am first and foremost a seeker of truth. And I'm an Aquarius, right? So I like understanding the way things work. I'm very science oriented. I wanted to know if there is actually any basis to these things in reality, or if this is, just some new age woo woo or whatever. And during this time, when I first started coming across this information, is when the internet really started posting information of what was going on around the world. I started seeing videos left and right of sinkholes opening up across the planet, of strange animal activity. In fact, the week I was reading this book on Edgar Casey, in Arkansas, they published a news article because tens of thousands of birds just dropped dead and they didn't know why. They couldn't understand it. And those similar things were happening all across the planet. Huge beachings of whales, sea life dying, all of these strange things. And so I started really diving into that and trying to understand what's going on. And without boring everybody with the process of how I arrived at it, now I think it's a good idea to talk about the actual science of this mechanism and how it works. Most of this information I got by stumbling across Ben Davidson's work and the Suspicious Observers YouTube channel. He is a fantastic researcher. He has dedicated his life to understanding the 12,000 year cycle, understanding the science behind it. And he has done an excellent job of putting together all of the bits and pieces, in my opinion. But essentially, what has been uncovered, and this is backed up by science, by the way, is that we live in a plasma universe. Everything is connected. Traditional mainstream science tends to treat everything as if it's in a vacuum, that everything is an island unto itself. But that's not reality. The reality is all things are connected through a vast field of electromagnetic energy. What happens on the sun affects the earth, and what happens on the earth affects us. And it scales up throughout the entire system. The science knows that our own solar system emanates what's called a heliosphere electric current sheet. The sun produces a field of electromagnetic energy, and it emanates from the center outward to the furthermost reaches of the solar system. And that field entrains the electromagnetic field of each of our planets. There's a communication, a back and forth between those fields electromagnetically. What Ben Davidson and other researchers and astrophysicists have discovered is that that is not unique to our solar system. It is every system, including the Milky Way galaxy. And so, from the center of the Milky Way galaxy is being emitted a tremendous electromagnetic current sheet that it ripples like the waves of the ocean. And it is essentially electromagnetic energy, a tremendous field. And just like your Swiffer duster at home that collects dust so powerfully using static charge, the galactic current sheet attracts dust and debris and all manner of stuff from space, collects into this wave. Science has measured the wave, and that we know from each peak to the trough and back to the next peak of this wave is 12,000 years. So every 12,000 years, our solar system encounters the next wave of that electromagnetic current sheet. And it entrains the field of our system, starting with the outermost planets of the solar system, the Earth, and then the Sun. It forces them and basically into alignment with the energy of this galactic current sheet. By the way, Voyager 1 and 2 encountered the galactic current sheet on their exit of our solar system, and that's been measured and documented. There's a mountain of scientific evidence to support this. But basically what happens is every 12,000 years, as we encounter that next wave of electromagnetic energy, it is a reverse in polarity from the previous crest. So it triggers an electromagnetic reversal of the entire system. Not just Earth, our planet, but all of the planets of the solar system and our star, the sun, as well. And whenever that happens, the magnetic field of our planet, which is the shield that protects us from cosmic rays and charged particles and solar radiation, it begins to weaken and the poles wander. They actually go closer to each other until they basically meet at one point, and then the field will disappear for a period of time before it repopulates and pops up on opposite positions of the planet. Again, science knows this. This part is actually mainstream. Science knows and admits we are in the middle of a magnetic reversal of this planet right now. It really started in 1865 with the Carrington event, which was a massive X-class solar flare that caught telegraph wires on fire and burned down buildings worldwide. At the time, that was the only electrical implements that we really had, was the telegraph system. But that event triggered the reversal. The poles, which were normally kind of wobbling around back and forth for hundreds and thousands of years, started racing from their normal stations. The North Pole is no longer stationed in the North Pole. It's racing towards Siberia. And the South Pole has left the continent of Antarctica now. They're racing to meet each other. And on the opposite side of our planet, from where the poles are set to meet, there is an anomaly known as the South Atlantic anomaly, which is a growing hole in the magnetic field where it is many thousands of nanoteslas weaker than the rest of the magnetic field. It's doubled in size in the last several years. And it eventually will grow to encompass the majority of the planet the closer that the poles get to one another. So I discovered the physical mechanism through various sources of how this magnetic polar reversal occurs. Mainstream science says this has happened several times throughout history. We have evidence of it in the magnetic record, which is recorded in cooling lava, things like that, pottery shards. It's not that big of a deal, they say. It won't be a big deal for humanity, and that nobody should worry about it. But that's only because they don't want to cause mainstream panic. And I understand that. If the full knowledge of the 12,000 year cycle was made mainstream and the governments of the world announced it to the public, the world would erupt into chaos. People would not go to work. They would not pay their taxes. And the entire system would come crashing down long before anything like this occurred. So we're at a point right now. I'm glad that you brought that up. That's perfect timing. Where the poles are destabilizing. Not only is the overall magnetic field weakening and creating this hole, the South Atlantic anomaly, but it is beginning to destabilize from the typical dipole pattern, with just a strong north and a strong south. There are areas that are much stronger than others, and areas that are much stronger, or I'm sorry, much weaker than the rest of it. It's becoming much more chaotic, essentially. And that is what is typically seen in a magnetic excursion as the poles weaken. One of the key points that is really a smoking gun whenever you're talking about the reality of this and where is the hard proof, the hard science that supports this. Right now, astrophysicists and those studying the magnetosphere, they produce the world magnetic model. It's updated usually every 5 years like clockwork, because all of the electronics have to be calibrated. Your GPS, the satellites, all of that. As the poles move and weaken, that magnetic model has to be updated to reorient things back to the magnetic field in order for them to function properly. So the official numbers of the magnetic field are published. It's made available to the public. You can see how it has evolved over time. And the official story is that we have lost about 10% of the magnetosphere since the 1860s, which is bad, but it doesn't sound nearly as bad as what it potentially could be. The smoking gun here is that 6 times since we've recorded them, the sun has had a solar flare that produced a coronal mass ejection that was strong enough to cause low latitude aurora borealis far into the southern states. That's only happened 6 times that we know of. And only one of those times wasn't in the last few years. 5 out of those 6 occurrences has been in the last 2 or 3 years. And that low latitude aurora, or the auroras being visible throughout the United States, into Mexico, sometime even down into Puerto Rico, the auroras have been visible during these coronal mass ejections. Weaker and weaker solar flares are producing those results. And if you look at the physics involved, that would not be possible if we were setting at 90% field strength. You can run the calculations on that, and it would be absolutely impossible if our field was at 90% strength and just as it had always been, or had been for the last 150 years. About 5 or 6 years ago, we had solar flares that were much, much stronger, and they did not produce the auroras down into Puerto Rico. The fact that in the last 2 or 3 years that's happened 5 times with weaker and weaker flares proves that the field is in a state of disarray and has weakened quite a bit above what the official number is. So I've talked enough at this point, I think, about the physical mechanism and the science of all of this. But the most important part that I have not spoke on at all, and this is the part I think is usually lost in translation. There are hundreds or perhaps thousands of content creators who are talking about the 12,000 year cycle now. It's almost mainstream at this point. Knowledge of it is increasing tremendously. But the vast majority of people who are talking about the 12,000 year cycle only talk about the bad stuff, the physical earth changes, the catastrophe, the devastation that we've seen in previous cycles. But what Edgar Cayce said is that this cycle is the 12,000 year cycle as a whole is first and foremost a spiritual energetic shift that ends or wipes the slate clean of a previous age, a previous cycle, and allows for the beginning of a new cycle or a new age with a clean slate. And because this is spiritual and energetic, there is a strong karmic component to this cycle. In fact, Edgar Cayce said that the main reason that there was this cycle 12,000 years ago that is recorded all across the planet and almost every single legend from indigenous cultures of the global flood and this destruction. It is because that Atlantis had discovered very advanced technology and that there was basically a faction in the society, a split, where not everyone was still in tune and highly spiritual. such as the high priest and his followers, that some of the technologies they discovered were misused, and it led to an energetic imbalance in the world that needed to be restored. And that's why the continent of Atlantis was the bearer of the brunt of that cycle, why their continent was entirely wiped out and sunk beneath the waves, because they were the root cause, essentially, of this energetic karmic imbalance in the world. He even went as far as to warn that unless things changed very quickly and in the right direction, the United States in this cycle would bear the brunt of the catastrophic earth changes that were going to unfold. But he also said this is the end of the cycle and that the earth is renewing itself, and it marks the beginning of the new age, the age of Aquarius that's been talked about for thousands of years. Again, almost every indigenous culture on the planet has some form of legend or myth that talks about the vast cycles of time, the ages, whether you're talking about the Mayan, the Hopi, or even the yugas of the Hindu. It's all over the place, and there's a high degree of agreement between them on what exactly that looks like. The fact that this is first and foremost a spiritual and energetic cycle is something that I think should be focused on and certainly not overlooked. It might not get as many clicks or as many views as talking about, the end of the world and everything's going to be destroyed. But I think that it is ultimately the reality that this cycle cleans the slate. It rebalances the scales of karmic justice and ushers in the new age. And Edgar Casey articulated in his readings very beautifully the physical mechanism of our spiritual awakening and how it is the same physical mechanism that produces the earth changes, the polar reversal, the shifting of the climates. He said basically that as the sun encounters this field in the cosmos, it produces changes within the sun. The fusion process that is going on our star changes so that it's producing a higher concentration of helium than it once did, which changes the spectrum of the wavelength of light it's emitting. It is much brighter white than what it used to be. Mm-hmm. Several of you probably remember in the past, maybe as a child growing up, you could look up at midday and see the sun, and it would be a yellow, a bright yellow. Mm-hmm. When's the last time that you've seen that other than a sunrise or sunset? It's very intensely bright white. And science knows this and acknowledges it. It's a result of these changes. And so what that means is the spectrum of electromagnetic energy that the sun is emitting is evolved. It's vibrating at a higher rate than it used to. And because the earth is entrained with the electromagnetic field of the sun, that means the earth begins to vibrate at a much higher rate as well. Our bodies are electromagnetic systems, just the same. And so it goes from the sun to the earth and then to us. And we also begin to vibrate at a much higher frequency than we used to do. And that is the primary driver of our spiritual evolution. That's why we see the mass spiritual awakenings going on the planet right now. The closer that we nudge to the end of the cycle and the beginning of the Age of Aquarius, this shift is producing physical changes in the earth, such as the earth changes and the magnetic field reversal. But it is also producing physical, energetic, and spiritual changes within our bodies as well. And science is beginning to see the big picture whenever it comes to this. We, as an example, there is some science that points to the fact that our bodies have a conversation with the sun, essentially. We have photoreceptors all over our body. Our skin absorbs the energy, the electromagnetic fields of the sun in the form of light. And that information contained within that field informs our body. It's what turns on and off the gene expression of our DNA. And geneticists say that roughly 97% of the human genome is junk DNA. It's not junk, it's the gene expression that the sun is turning on and off. And that is the driver of our physical evolution. Edgar Casey said that the sun ultimately is the driver of both all of the physical earth changes and our spiritual awakening and our spiritual evolution through this process, basically. And he said that after this shift, that our bodies would undergo very powerful changes, that our bodies would vibrate at a higher frequency, that we would develop new major chakra centers within the body for a total of 12 major chakras, that we would become less dense in matter and would become more light. And that would be the next root race of humanity as we physically and spiritually evolve into the age of Aquarius. There is so much to this story to try and capture every bit of it, but it is important to know that there's evidence of this cycle in almost every single discipline of hard science, such as the sediment deposits, ice core samples, archaeology, even anthropology, looking at the legends from across the planet, hundreds of them that all have some ancestral memory of this cataclysm. And even with the physical mechanism of this cycle, there is evidence within the major disciplines of hard science. And the prophecies, the spiritual and religious writings from um, the vast majority of cultures on this planet. The Hindu have the Kali Yuga. The Hopi talk about the earth turning over. The Mayans predicted the end of the age on December 21st, 2012, marked that as the beginning of the next age. And it's not just those; it is all over the place, even within the Judeo-Christian experience. Maybe not even within, but especially within, because to me, some of the most powerful prophecies and explanations that align with this 12,000 year cycle come from the Judeo Christian world. In the book of Matthew, Yeshua talked about the end of the age and what to expect. And he called the period of time that we're in now, he likened it to the birth pains, saying that at the end of the age, it would be like a woman in childbirth, and that those birth pains start out relatively mild and far apart. But as things progress and speed up, the birth pains come closer and closer together, faster and more intense, up until the moment of crowning as the new earth, the new age is born into existence. And especially within the book of Revelation, in Revelation, beginning in chapter 6, I believe it is, there is a very vivid depiction of this exact scenario of a polar reversal, of the earth turning over, of catastrophic earth changes that was written 2,000 years ago. And it reads word for word like what you would expect to happen in the midst of a polar reversal and the earth turning over. roughly it said something along the lines of there was a massive earthquake unlike any the earth had ever seen, and every island and every mountain will be removed from its place, and the sky rolled up like a scroll and receded. And it talked about the sun going dark, about the moon turning blood red. Every single one of those details is very much in alignment with the polar reversal, with the earth turning over. And importantly, Edgar Casey talked about this transition into the age of Aquarius in the context of the book of Revelation. And he said that the 1,000 years of peace that has been prophesied will only be made possible because of this energetic and spiritual evolution at the conclusion of the end of this age, the end of the cycle. And one of the most interesting tidbits of information that I've come across in the Casey material about this is he said that women, the divine feminine, would become the gatekeepers, the enforcers of the 1,000 years of peace, that their bodies will vibrate so high of a frequency, that their uterus will be vibrating so high that no low vibrational entities will be able to take up root and be born into the world, effectively weeding out low vibrational entities from incarnation, and that it being the physical mechanism of the 1,000 years of peace. I find that very intriguing with the grand scheme of things, looking at the big picture. So one other thing that I definitely want to touch on, and then I would love for you to ask some questions and stuff to probe some more information out of me. One of the things that I have been doing a lot of research on recently is about the connection between the magnetic field, the magnetosphere, and our consciousness. As far as I know, this is my own theory. I've not yet found anyone anywhere else who's talking about this, but I believe there is enough evidence to support the belief that the magnetic field is much more than just a shield of our planet that protects the earth from cosmic rays, radiation, charged particles, but that it acts as a modulator of consciousness and essentially is what generates the veil that has been spoken of in numerous spiritual disciplines, the veil that separates different dimensions of consciousness. And so if that theory, if that hypothesis is correct, the thinner the veil gets, or vice versa, the weaker the magnetic field gets, the thinner the veil gets. So people will be exposed to increasing amounts of energy from space, from the sun, from the cosmos. And again, this is not just mere energy like electricity, it is energetic vibration. And there is a spiritual component of this. So if the magnetic field modulates consciousness and it is getting weaker and weaker until it essentially vanishes, then we could see a thinning and disappearance of the veil, which separates the different dimensions of reality, the different dimensions of consciousness, such as us from the spiritual dimensions of life. That's actually been prophesied as well by several different people. And there has been some research that really points to this. Dr. Michael Persinger developed, through his research, an implement that's, I think they called it the God helmet. But basically, he discovered in his lab that low voltage electromagnetic stimulation of the frontal lobes produces psychic phenomena. It produces the ability to see things you normally wouldn't be able to see, to induce psychic states and all manner of things. And it does not prove that the magnetic field modulates consciousness, but it definitely says that the magnetic field and all magnetic fields have some bearing on consciousness, because we know it can be altered, it can be manipulated with electromagnetic stimulation. And this is why I think there have been prophecies that say at the end of the age that the veil will fall and that men's hearts will fail them from fear, from fright, for the things that they encounter that have never before been encountered, or at least in recent times. Because I think the different dimensions of reality will literally co-inhabit the same space, and we will come face to face with things that we normally don't see until the magnetic field repopulates itself, and then the field comes back, and then the veil comes back. This mechanism, by the way, is what science has discovered triggers the widespread amnesia, this tremendous drop in the Earth's magnetic field, and then tremendous blasts of energy from the sun. That's another aspect of this that I kind of glossed over and I failed to mention. There is evidence in the 12,000 year cycle that the sun may micronova, and that doesn't just come from astrophysics. It also comes from the archaeological evidence, from the sediment deposits, from every main discipline of hard science, as well as from the legends and myths. Dr. Robert Schoch wrote a book called Forgotten Civilization, where he pieced together a hypothesis that the 12,000 year cycle happens and that it is triggered by a solar micronova, by the sun emitting a tremendous burst of energy that is obviously catastrophic for the planet and its inhabitants. And he found evidence all across the planet where indigenous cultures had recorded in cave art images of a solar micronova, plasma figures that really can only be reproduced in a lab or a tremendous event such as a micronova. These plasmic images would become visible in the atmosphere from this tremendous burst of energy from the sun. And there has been an important link by Ben Davidson and several other researchers on the solar micronova theory, and that is the connection with the galactic current sheet. Remember earlier whenever I said that because of its electromagnetic charge, it attracts and draws to it dust and debris from space. Those waves of energy bring all of that dust and debris into the solar system and then deposit it onto the outer corona of the sun until it builds and starts to form like a crust. And the sun, the theory goes, becomes darkened for a period of time until the fusion process within the sun produces enough energy to overcome that outer shell. And then there is a tremendous blast of energy, producing a micronova and ejecting tons and tons of material out into space and towards the Earth, including impactors, parts of that crust that has been blasted away. Interestingly, there have been particles discovered on the moon that point to past solar novas from our sun, although it has been attributed to somehow distant novas from other systems blasting it this far, because science at the time didn't understand how our sun could possibly nova and produce these particles on the moon. And likewise, at the last cycle, 12,000 years ago, that science calls the Younger Dryas period, across the planet, there is a layer that is called the black mat layer that covers everything, especially in North America and South America, but it's also been discovered across Europe. And it is this thin black layer of sediment that has been charred and burned, and it contains nanodiamonds and platinum and iridium and all of these elements and things that should not be there. And science has speculated and said, well, there must have been some tremendous comet or impact or something that deposited all of these elements here, because that's the only way it could happen. Because they did not know that our sun was capable of a micronova. That is still debated, right? It's not accepted in mainstream astrophysics. But we do know now that novas don't have to be these tremendous blasts like we normally see in the cosmos. They can produce much smaller events called micronovas. So science has at least come around to understanding that, even if they haven't fully accepted the fact that our sun has a history of exploding into micronovas. Okay, I think now's a good time for me to stop talking for a moment. I don't know what areas I've left out, Casey, because I know this is a huge topic, and I've not covered everything for sure. But is there anything in particular that you think we should discuss that I didn't cover very thoroughly?
Yeah, something that I was thinking about, or for people that maybe don't know, what kinds of events or phenomena would you say would be included when we talk about these upcoming Earth changes?
Well, I think the Earth changes are already here, first of all.
Absolutely. That was my next question.
They've been occurring for a while now, and they are being explained away by mainstream narratives in various ways. And one of the biggest ones, I believe, is the climate. Okay, there's all of the talk about climate change and global warming and how it is 100% the result of man-made carbon emissions and poisoning the environment. And I think that is factually incorrect. I don't mean to say at all that we don't have an impact on the earth or the environment, because we have made tremendous impacts. Since the Industrial Revolution, we have basically raped and pillaged and plundered the earth, and we have definitely polluted the earth. And I don't think those are good things. And they certainly need to change, because they have no place in the Age of Aquarius. But the larger big picture of things, if you take a step back, it is obvious that the climate is shifting because it is part of a natural cycle. It is done so with incredible accuracy in alignment with the 12,000 year cycle. This is one of the feedback loops of these changes occurring: the magnetic field weakening, the increase in energy, charged particles, neutrinos, everything making it into the core of the earth. It's producing changes. And at first that starts looking like the climate's shifting. The AMOC current in the Atlantic has all but shut down. Scientists have announced in the past year that the AMOC is shutting down. And that is the Atlantic circulating current that is believed to be basically the driver of the entire ocean system. If any of you guys have seen the movie The Day After Tomorrow, That entire scenario was based on the concept of the AMOC shutting down and triggering this um, massive global superstorm that resulted in an ice age. That scenario is unfolding now. Science has announced that the AMOC is shutting down. Now, I'm not saying that that will produce an ice age, but if that truly is the engine of our oceans, that is the generator of our weather patterns, essentially. The ocean currents, the heat transfer, all of that builds into the storms, the hurricanes, the thunderstorms that we see across the planet. Every single bit of that is connected. So yes, the climate is shifting, but it's shifting because of it's reflecting these changes that are ongoing in our solar system and with the planet itself. I think it's really important to understand the concept of field entrainment and to understand that our Earth is essentially a giant capacitor for energy. The sun produces energy and then blasts it out into space, and our Earth absorbs quite a bit of that. In the past, the magnetic field reflects a certain percentage of that, but that energy goes into the circuit of the Earth, this energetic circuitry. And whenever it becomes overloaded, just like any other electrical system, it must discharge. Like if you were to walk across the carpet in socks and you scoot your feet, if you touch a doorknob, you will feel a little bit of a shock. The Earth does this too, and it discharges that energy through through various means, like hurricanes, thunderstorms, volcanoes, earthquakes. This fact is slowly being understood by mainstream science. But this is the reason why, whenever a volcano erupts, you will see tremendous bolts of lightning erupting from the volcano skywards. It is discharging the electrical circuit because it has been overloaded by all of this energy. And it's the same with earthquakes. This is why people have reported strange noises, strange feelings preceding an earthquake, and even strange lights and aerial phenomena in the sky over the earthquakes. It's because the Earth's electrical circuit is discharging the energy through that portion. And so, if the magnetic field is weakening and the sun is ramping up, that means the Earth is going to be taking in a whole lot more energy than it usually does, which means it will necessitate a whole lot more discharge than what we normally would see. So those Earth changes, I think we're going to begin seeing climates shifting erratically. We're going to probably start seeing anomalous extreme weather events become more and more common. The 1,000-year floods, those things are already happening, but it will increase with intensity and frequency up until the point that the balance is restored. So obviously, extreme earthquakes, volcanism opening up, all of those different modalities for discharging this energy from the Earth circuit, I think is going to increase.
Do you have any idea of what regions would most likely be impacted first?
I honestly don't have a whole lot of information on that area, but I have some ideas and feelings that are my own personal hypothesis with that. If you look at the magnetic field as a whole, it's mapped. Every 5 years they release a map of the magnetic field. That's how we know about the South Atlantic anomaly. And it is growing at a tremendous rate, which means it's getting weaker and weaker over that area. Those areas will take in likely much more energy than other areas. They've already begun reducing flights over that area and satellites have to avoid that area because they will be taken out because of this current of energy penetrating the magnetic fields there. This doesn't necessarily mean that the Earth changes will be more tightly controlled or limited to that area. But I do think it is likely that the first abrupt Earth changes will occur on the weakest portions of the magnetic field. If the veil is generated by the magnetic field, I would anticipate in the future those otherworldly events occurring in those areas where the field is the weakest. As for the planet as a whole, the Ring of Fire is an obvious one for me. It's one of the, if not the primary discharge of the overload of the Earth's circuit. And we are beginning to see an awakening of the Ring of Fire. There's been a strong increase in the earthquakes and volcanoes of that region. And actually, just a couple of weeks ago, we seen the earthquake in Russia that was the 6th largest in recorded history. And I don't think that that's anywhere near done. I think that those things are going to begin ramping up and will become much more common occurrence in our day-to-day life. Mm-hmm. But as things progress, as the field gets weaker and more energy gets through, we have a much stronger chance of losing the electricity on this planet. And that is something that I think, whether you believe anything that I've shared with you here today or not, that mainstream science supports, and it would be probably a wise idea to prepare for. Astrophysicists consider that the probability of the sun producing a coronal mass ejection strong enough and aimed at Earth to produce a global EMP, they consider that not to be a question of if it's possible, but when will it happen? Because it statistically is inevitable that the Earth will be hit by a coronal mass ejection that is big enough to wipe out electronics on the Earth. And if you couple that with the weakening magnetic field and the sun ramping up into solar maximum, there is a very strong likelihood that we see a global EMP wipe out our electrical way of life globally before, perhaps years before, the polar reversal and the full spectrum of Earth changes that announce the end of the age and mark the beginning of the new age. And this point does align with the vision that I was shown also, because at the beginning of her vision, everyone was walking. There was no cars. And a huge part of this research I've been doing is looking at what governments of the world know about and what they're preparing for. It is blatantly obvious that there is a global elite faction that is well aware of these cycles and are actively making preparations for themselves. The rise in people constructing doomsday bunkers and or rockets to leave Earth and go to other areas, it's pretty overwhelming, honestly. There's a whole field of evidence along those lines.
What do you think that people should understand physically and spiritually about living through times of this increased natural activity, Ryan?
I'm glad that you asked that, because I think that's probably the most important thing to keep in mind. I believe that none of us are here by accident, that our souls chose to incarnate here and now for a specific reason. There is a reason why in our lifetime now, the human population on this planet has exploded. It is quadrupled, right? There's this mass influx of souls into the earth plane, into the third density. And that is because this is the biggest show in the universe right now. We are ending a great age and beginning a new age and entering into a period of time to where we can embody Christ consciousness in the age of Aquarius and shift as a collective into this new frequency and vibration. And a lot of souls want a piece of that action. A lot of souls want to be a part of that. And so I think if you're alive here and now, it is because your soul chose to be. This it's not a coincidence. And I don't think that we're here to be bystanders in the bleachers watching the game unfold. We are here to be active participants to bring about the age of Aquarius and Christ consciousness, to help sow seeds of awakening so that we can collectively choose the path of peace and wholeness and oneness, as opposed to the path of self destruction that collectively we've been on for thousands of years.
So, in closing, what would be your message of hope or empowerment you'd like to leave listeners who might feel anxious about this?
I actually intended to lead with this information, but I got a little carried away and passionate, and so I
No, it's
failed to mention this.
perfect.
I think it is absolutely critical for anyone and everyone to understand that our mind impacts reality. Science is slowly coming around to this fact. We know now that consciousness is the organizing principle of energy into matter. That was reflected in the double slit experiment. Your thoughts impact reality. And so this becomes a very delicate topic to talk about with people because what you think about, you bring about. And so the last thing that we want to do is to invite in and create a situation of mass death and destruction and chaos. And the world has enough of that. We don't need to add to that at all. I think it's important to understand that this is first and foremost an energetic and spiritual shift to clean the slate, to rebalance the scales of justice, and to create the backdrop that allows things like mass spiritual awakening, expansion of consciousness into Christ consciousness, where the veil falls and the illusion of separateness dissolves, and we begin to understand that all life is sacred and holy, and that we are all truly one, as Yeshua was trying to get the world to see 2,000 years ago. And so all of this is in preparation of the 1,000 years of peace. It all paves the way for the entrance of the age of Aquarius. And to me, that is a glorious and beautiful thing that needs to be celebrated. And if you can look at these changes from that light, as opposed to the doom and gloom and the fear and getting sucked into those downward spirals, I think that that definitely helps. And it is, again, important to remember this is an energetic shift. And even with biblical prophecy, if you look at something like the book of Revelation, it talks about those being sealed with the name of God on their foreheads. That is an energetic seal by frequency vibration, that those that are in alignment with truth are shielded and protected from the calamities, from the disasters, and the destruction. But it is only as a result of their frequency vibration, their alignment with divine will.
Absolutely, for such a time as this. Well, that was such a fascinating dive into this subject, Brian. I always find conversations like this kind of leave you more to reflect on long after they end. So I hope that everybody that's been here and that watches afterward, that you walk away with some insight around this and maybe even a shift in how you see the times that we're living in. So I'd invite you to explore Brian's work further. Be sure to visit him on his website, and he has so much wisdom to share there. Brian, is there anything that you'd like to end with here before we close out?
The only thing that I will say, because I've said enough
Yeah.
for a while, if anyone is interested in learning more about this, I've been studying this topic and all of the subtopics associated with it for 20 years now. And I have gathered together into one collection a research document that brings in all of the disciplines, not only the hard disciplines of science, but anthropology, archaeology, religion, prophecy, every bit of it that has a bearing on the 12,000 year cycle and the age of Aquarius. And if you're interested in that, I have a link to it on my website under the research tab at the top of the page. And that is a living document that I am continually updating as new information comes out. Other than that, I just want to thank you for this opportunity to share this moment with the collective and be a part of this.
I've been looking forward to this for quite some time. It's been a little while in the works. So we so appreciate your time. And you guys be sure to go show Brian some love on his YouTube as well. What was the name of the YouTube again? I put the link up, but I don't recall the name.
Magi Rising.
Magi Rising. Okay. All right, guys, we hope you have a beautiful weekend. And I'm sure Brian will return with more information and other subjects on this if he's open to that. And we'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.